DHS announces $77 million in grant funding to combat domestic terrorism and extremism. And we are hearing all about what they can't do, and we see what they are doing, which is this. And we also remember that everybody was clamoring to defund the police all summer. And now the DHS announces $77 million in grant funding to combat domestic terrorism and extremism. And I want you to remember that the federal government is having a hard time. No, they're just refusing, not even having a hard time. They are refusing to label white supremacists as domestic terrorists. So who are they talking about when they say that they're giving them $77 million to combat domestic terrorism? And I'm going to read on. The Department of Homeland Security said Thursday it will provide $77 million in grant funding for state and federal governments to combat domestic violent extremism, announcing one of Biden administration's first concrete measures aimed at preventing attacks on homegrown terrorists. So you mean to tell me that Biden, who was the author of Biden's law, which had a huge role in the mass incarceration of black people in this country.
That 1994 crime bill, it did contribute to mass incarceration in our country.
The other big piece of legislation on Capitol Hill tonight is the crime bill.
Now, violent crime peaked in 1991, and the drafters of the bill didn't know that in 1993 and 1994 when they were drafting and signing it. Urban areas, urban cities across the country were ravaged by crack cocaine, and Americans were afraid of crime. The 1994 crime bill was signed by President Bill Clinton. This was a pretty significant bill at the time, and President Clinton and Senator Biden at the time were right that the bill was significant.
The most significant federal effort to deal with violent crime in America that has ever been undertaken.
And at the time, the Congressional Black Caucus was part of the debate around the crime bill. And the Congressional Black Caucus didn't want every provision that was included in this bill. It became clear that the provisions in the 94 crime bill were going to be a political compromise. It also provided huge amounts of funding to hire cops. 100,000 cops were funded. It was about $14 million at the time for community policing. $12 billion that was authorized for states across the country that would enact what's called truth in sentencing laws. That funding literally paid states to increase the number of prison beds that they allocated for individuals convicted of violent crime in this country to serve 85% of their sentences behind bars. The reason that provision is so important, and the reason we're still talking about it today, is the federal government essentially subsidized states across the country to build more prisons. So 25 years later, the crime bill is being debated.
You stood up and used that tough on crime, phony rhetoric.
That bill was a huge mistake.
There's no question that that crime bill contributed to America's mass incarceration problem.
1994 crime bill, we had a gigantic epidemic in America of violence, particularly in African American communities. The notion was overwhelmingly supported. It was supported by the Black Caucus in the United States Senate by and large.
And the reason that the crime bill comes up so often is, today in 2019, it is hard for so many people to understand why the federal government would pay states to incarcerate more people, given the devastating consequences we know that incarceration causes. But at the time, policymakers felt the need to respond to what they felt was uncontrolled violence, and this bill was the way that policymakers, that Congress could say, or do something about it.
Violent crime and the fear it provokes are crippling our society. The crime bill before Congress gives you a chance to do something about it, a chance to be tough and smart.
We need to examine the crime bill and all of the federal bills that galvanized prison spending, that galvanized more arrest, more incarceration, and we need to look to the future. And today, the United States leads the world in terms of incarceration. In fact, if each state were its own country, 23 states would have the highest incarceration rate in the world.
Ben told us that he wasn't defunding nothing.
I'm going to do what I've done in the past. I'm going to bring all these interests together. Peaceful protesters, police chiefs, police officers, the police unions, as well as the civil rights groups in the White House, and sit down and decide what are the things that need to be done to improve and help police officers. I'm the only one who's talked about increasing police budgets.
And on top of him not defunding them, he is going to give them $77 million under the guise of combating domestic terrorism. DHS security Alejandro Mayorkas and other Biden officials have told lawmakers that they will do more to address threats posed by violent groups, including white supremacists, an urgency that has increased since January 6th, that's the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. Like I said, yeah, they can say all of this now, but they have failed to label white supremacists every single time. So who are they going to really use this money against? And also, the same white supremacists that they are neglecting to punish right now, in the almost 20 years since September 11th in 2001, the terrorism threat landscape has changed considerably, Mayorkas said in a statement, referring to the terrorist attacks that led to the creation of the DHS. Today, the most significant terrorist threat facing the nation comes from lone offenders and small groups of individuals who commit acts of violence motivated by domestic extremist ideological beliefs. Sounds very broad. While we continue to lawfully protect against threats posed by foreign terrorist organizations, we must also ensure adequate focus and funding is provided to combat domestic terrorism, some of which is motivated by false narratives and extreme rhetoric spread through social media and other online platforms, Mayorkas added. The money, part of a larger $1.87 billion pool of grant funding to help the state and local federal governments face threats and emergencies, will help raise the nation's security baseline, according to Mayorkas. The grants for domestic violent extremism will fund programs aimed at open source analysis of threats, execution of threat assessment programs, the development of sharing intelligence across states, between states and federal governments, and the development of training and awareness programs, he says. All I hear is that you funding the police. You do not have a history of, like I said, y'all ain't prosecuting none of them now. What's his name? Isn't he getting, the one with the horns, isn't he getting vegan food in jail?
A court decided the so-called Q shaman arrested after the U.S. Capitol breach should get organic food while in jail. St. Louis attorney Al Watkins is representing Jacob Chansley. Chansley was pictured shirtless, wearing horns and fur inside the Capitol building January 6th. Watkins filed a motion saying Chansley is, quote, wasting away behind bars in Washington, D.C., and he should be released before his trial. The motion stated because of his shaman beliefs, Chansley can only eat organic food, so he has not eaten in a week. A judge is ordering the jail to provide Chansley organic food.
Where's Prodigy to hear that? DHS in recent years has begun turning its attention inward to pay more attention to threats from hate groups, homegrown extremists, and violent racists. The 2019 mass shootings in El Paso, the deadliest attack on Hispanic Americans in the modern U.S. history. Was a catalyzing event for the department officials. DHS Office of Intelligence and Analysis was one of the federal agencies that did not alert, come on now, did not alert the federal law enforcement agencies to the plans by pro-Trump groups to storm the U.S. Capitol and attempt to prevent a presidential transition. Did you hear me? And they are giving this organization more money. For who? I'm going to read that statement again. DHS, Office and Intelligence and Analysis, was one of the federal agencies that did not alert federal law enforcement agencies to plans by pro-Trump groups to storm the U.S. goddamn Capitol and attempt to prevent a goddamn presidential transition. Pressure from the lawmakers on DHS to do more has increased since then, so let's give them $77 million. Yeah, that'll fix it. While the FBI remains the lead federal agency for investigating domestic extremist groups by stopping attacks, DHS officials went to leverage relationships with the state and local police departments formed after the 9/11 attacks to produce better threat reports and promote preventative strategies. A week after Biden's inauguration, DHS used the National Terrorist Advisory System for the first time to alert the police to the risk of attacks by domestic terrorists, citing a heightened threat of environment across the United States. In 2019, DHS created an Office for Targeted Violence Terrorism Prevention, which has hired regional coordinators across the country to help state and local governments identify violent extremists and try to stop them from recruiting and radicalizing others. A lot of good that's doing. During recent hearings on Capitol Hill, because that's working so well that they stormed the Capitol. That's how good a job you're doing. That's why they had to give you $77 million. During recent hearings on Capitol Hill, many Republicans have joined Democrats in calling for DHS to increase its focus on homegrown extremists through lawmakers have crashed over priorities. Republican members say Democrats are unwilling to condemn violent protesters and anarchists during clashes last summer on the streets of Portland, Oregon, where DHS agents and officers were sent to protect federal buildings. Many Republicans insisted federal agencies should prioritize all homegrown violent extremists, regardless of ideology, while Democrats note FBI data showing white supremacists have been responsible for more American deaths.
Another thing about how perspectives change over time. Bobby Rush, member of Congress, said the other day, "I'm ashamed that I voted for the '94 crime bill." You ashamed of that bill?
Not at all. And in fact, I drafted the bill, as you remember.
I know that.
Sign up for free text alerts. You can find the link in my bio or in the description.